Welcome to our RPE web conference, RPE and non-RPE folks alike, for organizing and engaging youth in RPE. I'm going to turn it over to Jessie and she'll start us off.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Welcome. It's a beautiful morning where I am, so I hope it is for you all too. We're really excited to have this web conference. For those of you in RPE, today was a day we were supposed to be gathering in person. So while we are sad to not be with you all face to face, we're glad to have all of you and also other preventionists outside of the RPE program here with us online, and our new friends, Nisha and Dalton from Idaho. And so we're excited to be here. You know, this is a really important topic because youth historically have been at the forefront of social change. And as preventionists, we really have the opportunity to both center and uplift youth voices in change, and also to build bridges and open doors and open spaces at tables to share decision-making for the policies and the systems that are going to affect youth in their future, probably more than anyone. So the work that you all are doing with young people, particularly in opening space for young leaders, is so important. And so we hope today will give some more insight and perspective and ideas for that. I didn't introduce myself, though I did in the chat. I'm Jessie, Town Readiness Consultant with CalCasa. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And if you haven't already, please introduce yourself the same in the chat. And I am located in San Diego. So I want to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah, to take over.
Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Orton. I'm the RPE project coordinator with the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm excited to be here with you all today and learn with you all from our awesome presenters from the Idaho Coalition, who will let introduce themselves in just a couple of minutes. First, I will do some housekeeping stuff. I'm sure you've all heard the spiel from me many, many times before, but we are going to do it nonetheless. Can you give me the next slide, please, Dalton? As always, please follow us on all of the social medias. You can get information at calcasa.org, read our blogs. You can email info@calcasa for general questions, things like that. You can also email me, Sarah, for prevention and RPE related questions too, of course. Please remember to follow us at twitter.com/calcasa, facebook.com/calcasa. And also, of course, our prevention hub at learn.calcasa.org/hub. Next slide, please. Okay, so I have sent out numerous emails with agendas and learning objectives and things like that. So I will not go too deep into these, but here are our objectives for the day. Really what we're hoping, kind of our overarching objective here, is to have everybody walk away feeling a new sense of inspiration and invigoration for working with youth and youth mobilization and change, and really the things, the change that we can affect, and the social norms that we can, new social norms that we can create using our work with mobilizing youth. So that's really what we're hoping, but we do have these learning objectives. We will be, as always, administering a survey during the Q&A portion. I'm gonna drop that in the chat at the end of the web conference, the survey link on SurveyMonkey. Please follow the link, and it's like the quickest survey ever. Please take 2 minutes and just fill it out. It really, really helps us for a number of reasons to get your feedback. I think I say this pretty regularly, but we really, really do take your feedback and input, and that is almost the sole basis on which we determine the topics of our web conferences and trainings and TA and all of that. So, so that would be much appreciated. I will obviously mention that again at the end when we're going through or dropping the survey link into the chat. So right now I am going to start with our polling questions before turning it over to our very special guest stars. So as I said before, there's about 4 of them, there is 4 of them. I will be reading the question aloud, launching the poll. This is a way, just kind of a fun warm-up activity to get us thinking. Also, it's helpful for us and especially our presenters who don't know you all to kind of know where you're at with certain successes and challenges and where you're coming from quite literally in approaching this work. So the first question that we have is, what do you find most challenging about mobilizing youth leaders? Our choices are recruitment, retention, engagement, or mobilizing to action. I will be launching the poll right now. You all should see it on your screen. Please answer. Recruitment, of course, refers to getting folks into the group, getting word about your group out, the outreach piece. Retention is maybe you can get people into the group, but getting them to stick around is a really big challenge because obviously life happens. Young folks have a lot of things going on. Engagement is maybe you can get them into the group, maybe they stick around, but the energy is just super low. Or perhaps as it looks like some folks are answering, moving into that action piece and really taking the steps to affect change. So we will give it just a few 30 more seconds, maybe 20 more seconds. It looks like most folks have voted. So I can see the results right now, but you can't. And it looks like recruitment is in it's pretty evenly spread across the board actually, but recruitment is in the lead at 40%. I will go ahead and end the poll in about 5 seconds. So if you haven't participated yet and would like to, also if you are experiencing challenges that are not in this list, please feel free to let us know that in the chat too, if you don't like any of these choices. Okay, I'll share the results so you all can see. We have 43% recruitment is the winner, is the biggest challenge for folks in mobilizing youth leaders. That's good to know. We have engagement, keeping that energy up at a pretty close second. Then we have mobilizing into action and retention in last place at 26%. Interesting. And again, if you have anything else to share, if you want to explain why you shared the way or you answered the way that you did, please feel free to let us know in the chat. Okay, next poll. We would like to know what best describes your geographical location. We have metropolitan/urban, suburban, rural, and mixed/multiple service areas. I'm launching the poll right now, so you should see that up on your screen. We have rural coming in at a strong lead at 80%. Nice. All right, things are evening out a little bit. I feel like a sportscaster. I am not a sports person, so I don't actually really know what a sportscaster sounds like outside of like maybe TV and movies. But anyway, that's what I feel like when I'm kind of live narrating these polls to you and you can't see them. Okay, we have about 84% of folks who have voted. If you have not voted and would like to, please let us know. Oh, Stevie says I'm doing great. Thanks, Stevie. I appreciate it. That's very validating.
It reminds me of this bored sportscaster who's like announcing eating races between his dogs and stuff, Mabel and Olive. It's pretty funny if you haven't seen it yet, but your sportscasting is good.
Thanks. I appreciate it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, share the results. And it looks like still we have a pretty big lead in rural areas, at least for folks on this web conference. We have 29% of mixed or multiple service areas, so that's interesting. Then we have urban, metropolitan, big city folks, and then 14% in suburban. Poll number 3. Okay, so poll number 3, what do you find most exciting about mobilizing youth leaders? So this is kind of where we want our energy to be today, right? I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. We have hope, youth work helps shape the future, exposure to diverse points of view, and working with young people. Obviously, that's going to depend a lot on the age of the provider and location and background and all of those things. Energy and passion of young people is contagious. Shaping policy influenced by people who are most impacted. So being able to kind of act as that bridge in mobilizing young people to create policies and to create change that ultimately they're going to be the most impacted by as folks who are kind of coming out into the world. The opportunity to provide mentorship, guidance, support, or maybe none of these. And if not, you feel comfortable sharing in the chat something that you really love and really get energy from in working with young people, please let us know in the chat. I will leave this up for about 30 more seconds. If you have not voted yet and would like to, please do so. These are pretty evenly split across the board, actually, as I'm looking at them. Obviously, I will share with you in just a moment, but for some reason, I had a feeling that maybe like one of these was going to be a super, super strong leader, and it doesn't appear that way. Okay, about 8 more seconds, and then I'm going to close it up and share the results with all of you. Okay, you should see those results on your screen now. We can see that almost 50% find energy around a sense of hope, and I believe that youth work helps shapes the future. Let's see, we have second is shaping policy influenced by people who are most impacted by it. We have a tie for third place at the energy and passion of young people and the opportunity to provide guidance and support and kind of really lean into that mentorship role. And then last place, 30%, but still not a small percentage. We have exposure to diverse points of view. And surprisingly, 0% for other. Tell us in the chat. Every time I do a polling series, I always feel afraid that everyone is going to choose other, and that means that I am totally out of touch and didn't capture like at all what it is that people are thinking about, like challenges or energy from the work or anything like that. So this is great. Thank you for playing, y'all. And then we have one more. So this is just helpful. Our presenters were curious about this question, so we're going to launch it. What is your age range? So we'd like to know how, I guess, the age differences between most of our providers on the call and the young people who you're working with. So we're going to launch that poll now. You should see it on your screen. We did a range, multiple choice. These are always really big gaps. But that's just kind of the way it goes, I suppose. We have 18 to 25, 25 to 35, that's me, 35 to 45, 45 to 55, 55 to 65, and 65 plus. These are going pretty fast. I guess folks don't really have to like think too hard about how to answer this question. Okay, we have just over 90% of folks have voted. I'll give it about 5 more seconds. If you haven't voted and would like to, please do so now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share the results. You should see that on your screen. It looks like we have 36% at 18 to 25 and tied for 36% for 25 to 35. So these actually kind of go in the order that they're listed. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing those results now. Hopefully everyone got to see. Thanks very much for playing, y'all. So at this time, I am going to turn it over to Dalton and Nisha. I will let them introduce themselves. A quick note on where we are, why we wanted them to present. During Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, the Idaho Coalition sent campaign materials to all of the sister coalitions throughout the nation. And some of those materials ended up on my desk, one of them being the Meaningful Access Guide for working with underserved youth in rural communities. I thought it was amazing. They also have these really awesome posters that I ordered a bunch more of with the intention of disseminating had we ever seen each other in person again. And I have a couple at home. How much I like them. And I sent out a couple of the materials that they'll be talking about today in a registration email beforehand. I believe that went out yesterday. So you should have received that. I may or may not have had a chance to flip through that guide. But they do really amazing work with youth. I feel really excited about it. So we wanted to invite them on and give them a chance to share with all of you about some of the great strides that they've made in Idaho. So at this time, I will conclude my talking and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jessie.
Thank you so much. So I am Tanisha, I am Nisha, and my pronouns are they, them, their, and I'm a social change organizer at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, and I will let Dalton go ahead and just briefly introduce themselves. But we decided we wanted to grant in some breath and intention. So Dalton, go ahead and take it away, and we'll go ahead and move the people through some breath.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Magandang araw. My name's Dalton Dagundon Teagues. I'm one of many bilingual social change associates at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We're very grateful to Calcasa for inviting us to having this conversation with y'all about youth organizing. Any pronouns work for me. I've worked with Calcasa previously with their This Gen Youth Summit previously a couple years ago, and then working with them at the National Sexual Assault Conference in 2018. And then before we get started, we would like to start with the recognition of what's happening currently in the political and social climate with what's happening in Minneapolis. Nisha, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you. We have been basically having conversations. Dalton had said something earlier this morning about us all being the children of the people who are like fighting for a better world. And that's what we see in youth organizing. That's what we do this work for, many of us. And as a part of that, we know that like this is something that we do every day, that we live through every day, and that it is a big privilege to be able to live through it. And there's been a lot of grief and harm in the last few days, weeks, months, years. And so we just wanted to name that today. It was definitely like an elephant in the room. And we wanted to just bring it all of the power of our ancestors, our elders, our siblings, and our descendants. So I'm going to welcome us all to do some breath together. I'm just going to put my hand on my belly so we can do some belly breaths. We oftentimes breathe through our chest and have a lot of tension there, especially when we're grieving. So I welcome y'all to breathe through your belly. I'm going to lead us through 8 breaths, and then we will go from there. And this time, really exhale deep. All right. Thank y'all for having a moment to do that with us. That was something that we thought we could root with intention. And I really think the polling questions were really powerful in rooting us with intention. So thank you for starting us off with that. Dalton, do you want to go ahead and jump to the next slide and we can actually introduce ourselves and why we're here? Thank you. So as I said, my name is Nisha J. Newton. My pronouns are they, them, their, and I'm a facilitator here with y'all today. I'm a community organizer and a current grad student in social justice and human rights. I'm a semi-recent graduate with my BA in history, sociology, and social science secondary education. And as a human introduction, I really enjoy reading as a form of just liberation, a way of finding myself and my role in the work that I do. And I had recently come across a piece by Assata Shakur, which I feel like really captures who I am and the role that I do in the social justice spheres that I'm in. Assata says, to win any struggle for liberation, you have to have the way as well as the will, an overall ideology and strategy that stem from a scientific analysis of history and present conditions. And as somebody who's a historian and sociologist, an educator and a change maker, I really think that these words capture my role, because I think that it's important for me and others who have interests or backgrounds similar to leverage narratives, data, youth power, and elements of social justice behind the scenes to start to drive forward the emergent world that we want to work toward. I love to travel and I love to write, and I'm really excited to be here with y'all talking about ways that we can organize with young people into a future that accepts all of us and are thriving. Dalton, would you love to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
For sure. Thanks, Nisha. Hi, everyone. My name's Dalton. Again, any and all pronouns work for me. I love writing poetry. I love cooking with my cast iron. I also love capturing photos of pictures, taking pictures of people in unexpected places, not like a gotcha moment, but like documenting people's emotions while they're in public. And I also enjoy the outdoors. I'm an immigrant to this country from the Philippines, super, super queer. What other things? Oh yeah, I graduated with Nisha. Not as high as a grade or accolades as Nisha did, but I did make it through the same institutions that Nisha did. And I'm super grateful to be here today with y'all. And then, I'll give it back to Nisha to talk about the story of today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for telling us more about yourself. So Dalton and I are here to welcome you all and host you to the We Choose All of Us Youth Organizing to End Gender Violence webinar. And together, Dalton and I, we've known each other throughout the past few years, and we work together to build community and to rise with social justice leaders through We Choose All of Us, which is a youth organizing campaign with the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We work on teen dating violence prevention. We also do intervention outreach strategies for effective youth advocacy, especially in rural communities. So shout out all the rural communities. I'm glad to have all of y'all here in this space today, and hopefully the work that we do can really reach and impact the rural communities that a lot of y'all said you were from. We're here today as the story of today to talk to y'all about all things youth-led in social justice so that we can work meaningfully with youth, so that we can develop innovative collaborative approaches for help-seeking behavior in youth, and also just ways to use our trauma-informed responses, the ways that we see things as developmentally appropriate, all of the things together to come up with a new way of existing and new ways of creating social norms where we can prevent and intervene in violence. We want to go ahead and just dive right in. We have 5 elements of youth organizing we want to share with y'all today. But we also know that it's never healthy to really just jump into work, and that's a dominant culture habit we're trying to interrupt with the young people. So Dalton is going to go ahead and talk us through some questions in the chat box, and we'll start our presentation from there. I'm going to go ahead and post the question that Dalton will talk about.
Yeah, and so one thing that we want, because the majority of folks are from 18 through 35, about 70% of the folks attending this webinar. But a lot has happened since we were young people. And even to this day, when I'm working with the young people I help supervise with Nisha, a lot of things have happened where like I have no idea what they're talking about, and I'm only 22 years old. And so the things that their experiences and how their minds are being shaped is very different from ours. And so we would like to know from y'all on what social movements were present when you were younger. What did it sound like? What did it feel like? What did it taste like and look like? So please engage with us on the chat box. And then,
yeah, I'll go ahead and model it too. Dalton, go ahead and populate the chat box. I'll model it, and then Dalton will go ahead and read some of your responses. So social movements that were present when I was younger. I remember in my community, I grew up in Caldwell, Idaho, and a lot of the movement around me growing up was around like farm workers' rights. I remember that being a really prominent conversation, and there was a lot of advocacy initiatives around that. And as I got a little bit older growing up, there was a lot of anti-police brutality initiatives of people where I started getting really engaged with that. So when I think of like the census, it looks really brown. It feels good. It felt like a family reunion of sorts. There were people that I just never knew before, but it was just a space where people were like me. They thought like me. Unfortunately, I would say it tastes dehydrated. I don't think that I was as good in my youth and growing up about understanding that we needed to restore ourselves in the movement. So I think I like taste, dehydration, and sound. I hear loud music. I hear like we're strategizing, we're doing things in community, but powered by rhythm. I'm seeing some ideas come up in the chat box. Dalton, I'll let you read some of them, and I'll let y'all just keep typing as you're thinking about it.
Yeah, we have Paula saying that the civil rights movement, ending the war against Vietnam, the women's liberation movement, it all felt brave, strong, long, frustrating, hopeful, steps forwards and steps back. RD says the ongoing rainbow revolution, it feels affirming and joyful. Melissa said, as an elder millennial, anti-Iraq war in the environmental justice in Southeast Utah, y'all are fast. Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement. Laura says introduction to feminism. Another person said burning their bras and afraid. Queer and trans rights movement and women's movement significantly. Immigrant rights, student walkouts. Latinx people or Hispanic people taking jobs. It smelled like burnt tobacco. Tastes like Carl's Jr. Sounded like heavy breathing from a closed jaw. These some really intense memories, like chanting "Whose streets? Our streets." Yeah, and so when we're talking about reminding ourselves of how social movements influence and shape our realities as young people, this is what we are trying to replicate when we're trying to youth organize and maintain youth engagement. We want to replicate those feelings, not just as a means of retentions and reporting for your grants, but rather like we're continuing a legacy of people who have worked in the movement. And then because people were kind enough to show us our way to the revolution, we're going to find ways for younger people to find ways to the revolution as well.
I honestly like Kevin's response. Like I felt as if I was there. There's so many things I'm seeing in the chat box, and I'm grateful y'all are sharing with this. I hope that we're able to ground more in the conversation through this. I'm seeing things as like the anti-casteism movement. Feeling scary. There's a lot of those same energies and feelings now that young people are experiencing. Gun rights, climate change, anti-Iraq, war movement. There's so many things. And right now, our like story of today, our current era is marked by social movements of remarkable scale, which we've seen on and on throughout history. However, we're having discussions, especially recently, about the ways that technology connects us, the ways that we're actually all connecting together. So when we think about youth organizing today and some of the remarkable scale movements that perhaps they're seeing, the things that they're going to be able to look back on, we see things like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, gun violence prevention, immigrants' rights movements, and we see led by young people, specifically youth of color, young women and femmes, immigrant and queer youth. And we see that these people are leading it because they have lived experiences that are marked by inequality and injustice, and that they really have acute attention and energy around liberating themselves. Unfortunately, we see a lot of these young people also becoming targets because they are leading the movement. They're very involved in the movement. And so we are here to talk to you all today just about amidst this climate, amidst all of the things that we swam through and that youth are currently swimming through, we need to find resilience and healing and transformative ways of building power in community and rooting injustice. So I would like for Dalton to talk. This is what we do at the Coalition. This is what Dalton and I have built our lives around. And we want to share all of our secrets and formulas with y'all so that y'all can put your own spin on it. But we haven't always been that way. And I would really love if Dalton could use some transparency about the ways we used to organize around youth at the Coalition.
Yeah, thanks, Nisha. So at the Coalition currently, we've taken on the responsibility of building young leaders to move towards a world without gender-based violence. And because a world without gender-based violence is intricately connected to all forms of oppression, like ableism, racism, violence against all peoples, and anti-immigration sentiments, we are in it for the long haul. A conversation happening at the This Gen Youth Summit was to end violence within one generation, which is a really lofty goal, and no shade on Kalkasa and all the facilitators that put that together. But to end gender-based violence, we have to end all forms of violence. And because those forms of violence have had several hundred years a head start before our liberation and has taken traction in the world, it's going to take young people for us and continuing this and giving on our legacy with young folks. At the beginning, we didn't do everything always right. And I would like to contextualize throughout this entire time that we are still trying to figure it out. We will still occasionally fuck up, and the issue is that when we fuck up, we can't be the ones to shy away. We have to work through this together because no one is dispensable in a movement towards a world without violence. So in the beginning, most of our staff, I would say 90% of our staff at the Idaho Coalition in the early 2000s were white and white women particularly. And so no shade again to white women, but also in the world to end gender-based violence, white women alone do not have the answers to moving forwards towards that world. And so what we saw in our early youth organizing were children of these very upper echelon of professionals that we were mobilizing because we didn't pay them any money at all. We had children who were able to, or young folks who were able to afford not to do work and not not get paid for it. So they were children of doctors and lawyers. And then again, also no shade to them, but they did some good work. But in terms of mobilizing an entire community that is representative of all of the different populations, there were limitations to that. It all started changing around 2010. 2010, when our executive director, Kelly Miller, went through a transformative experience with the Move to End Violence, where she was bluntly woken up to the world where violence exists not just for white women. And it started transforming our conversations internally, and it was really messy. I remember our brown bag series at the beginning, which we don't do anymore because we found other methods to do it, was really intense. You could feel the tension in the office about why there weren't any Black people in the office and why there weren't any Latinx people in the office when those communities exist, those folks exist in our communities. And then so we started moving towards like, why haven't we started engaging with people from historically marginalized communities? And then we came to our own wisdom and saying, with the help of other folks outside of the state navigating us through this, on centering our work on historically marginalized communities. Jesse sent out the PDF to our guide to the meaningful access, practice to cultivate, and habits to erupt for, that's what Nisha just dropped in there. And that is a culmination of our learnings, but specifically it's been our learnings in the last 3 years on how to work with young folks from historically marginalized communities. What you see here in our picture is Buki Loa Bakula Ogan Rinola. She was a young person that we work with in our youth program, and now she's at Howard University, and we're super proud of her. This was at the first Women's March here in Boise. And so it was really great to just have a young Black and African Nigerian woman to speak in front of a sea of white people who came and like, this was their beginning, and we were going to take that chance. And so we're really grateful for Buki to speaking in front of that crowd. And we'll talk about youth engagement specifically later in other slides. Okay. And so on our 5 elements to youth organizing, it's another thing that we try to do is keep things very simple so that it's not heavily based in theory, and so that you can remember all 5 of them hopefully by the end of them. They're not very complex topics. They're very simple, and we want to be able to make sure that, and we recognize that all communities are able to do this, but it might look differently for every single community. And so we believe the picture here is Alyssa Wainaina, and this is at the March for Our Lives rally here in Boise, where young people walked out and for their safety in schools and the changing of gun reforms. But the thing about why we're investing in young people is that young people are an untapped source of power within our communities. They're an economic class. And so when we think about working with young people, we have to be able to pay them or find and work it into our budgets or find creative means of paying them. Youth, as Nisha mentioned, youth organizing has been the center of every single social movement. So everything from Arab Spring to most recently the Dakota Access Pipelines, these were things that were started by young people. So the 5 elements of youth organizing are intergenerational base building to connect power across communities. Transformative youth leadership is 2. And 3 is embody collective practices for wholeness, healing, and resilience. 4 is transformative campaigns. And then 5 is movements interconnected across issues. And then I'll pass it along to Nisha.
Yes, thank you. With these 5 elements that we're going to talk to you all about today, we are looking at ways of interrupting violence. We're looking at ways of interrupting multiple systemic oppressions and just the ways that we devalue and dehumanize communities, especially youth. This can be translated to so many things, and we want to make sure that everything that we talk about is clear today. So we're going to break down each point. I'm going to break down element 1, and we'll move forward. And if y'all have questions at any point, please drop them in the chat. We won't feel scared to tell y'all we'll get to that later or we'll get to that at the end. I would much rather hear it in real time. Dalton and I would rather process in real time. So we'll go ahead and begin breaking it down for y'all. And I welcome y'all to ask questions and go ahead and find ways that you can try this on for yourselves. So when we look at this slide for the element 1, it says intergenerational base building to connect power across communities. And I find that kind of wordy. And so I want to spend some time breaking that up with y'all. When we talk about intergenerational, it is a team or a group of people who comes from different generations, which could be boomers, which are baby boomers are anywhere from like 50s to 80s, depending on how it's defined. There's Generation X, which could be anywhere from 40s to 60s. Millennials, which could be 20s to 40s. And Generation Z, which is folks being born all the way up to 20s-ish. And there's a lot of ambiguity with that. But generally, when we talk about intergenerational teams, we think about two generations, and they're usually neighboring generations. So it's usually like baby boomers and Generation X, or Generation X and millennials. But we are really trying to challenge folks, and we're challenging ourselves to work with 3 or more generations and to work vibrantly together and find ways that we can coexist rather than creating a hierarchy based on ageism. So that's one thing that I really want to break down. When we're talking about intergenerational, we're talking about things that look more broad and more equally spread in terms of power and support. The other term I want to talk to you all about is base building. That, to me, is defined as work that's done at the base or the foundation. So it's not necessarily something that is auxiliary or representative or a liaison, and it can be all of those things. However, even if it's those things, we want it to be at the core. We want it to be intentional at the root. And there's a lot of national conversations being held about intergenerational structures and about ways we can base build and do authentic work together. But it's hard to really grasp what a national conversation is versus what we can actually do or what our organizations can do. And so to help me find my role in this and to help find the coalition's role in this, I imagine the analogy of a ladder. And I think of different generations being different rungs of the ladder, different ways that we could move up the ladder. And rather than doing it in a hierarchical way where perhaps like baby boomers are at the top or at the foundation, and then on the other side of that ladder would be Generation X, we want it to be very interactive. We want all of the generations spread throughout. But we don't want a narrow ladder. We want a very wide one. We want each generation to include a myriad of different communities, identities, backgrounds of experiences. So each generation is very wide and this ladder is long, and we're able to climb up together. So we have tried on similar analogies or different analogies that we could find ways to do intergenerational base building work with people who have been in various communities. And at the coalition, we decided that we were going to try this program that we call the YAN. It's the Youth Activist Network. And it is a group of 35 young people from throughout our community that we decided that we could come together and we would have spaces where we could do intentional activism together. We could have conversations with them about ways that young people in schools can interrupt harm. And it's this great idea. And we're going to do the intergenerational stuff that everyone's been talking about. But it's obviously scary. And there were hesitancies that we all likely carry about things like ageism. Are we actually going to be able to have youth in our space doing impactful, important contributions? Are we going to be able to see them as capable of doing that? We say that we have capacity and energy for youth work, but do we really? Like Dalton's been talking about pay. Are we actually going to pay them in the same way that we should pay other contractors or staff members? There's communication differences. Like each generation is known to have older generations probably perform like a professional email, whereas younger people don't mind slang, or like a DM as a way of like reminding them to show up for a meeting or for an event or something like that. So we're here to talk to y'all about things that we saw within the Youth Activist Network, things that we've seen in different campaigns. But throughout all of that, I think the most core part of element one, the ways that we saw we were able to build power across communities and through generations, is all about what we're going to see on this next slide. Dalton, if you could go ahead and move us to the next one. We found that we were able to do all of our base building and all of that work to build those wide ladders because we were centering youth from historically marginalized communities. We want these youth, we need these youth, they're exceptional leaders. And we know that young people already face disproportionate rates and impacts of sexual and domestic violence. And we also know that marginalized communities already have high disproportionate rates of sexual assault and domestic violence. So when we're working with young people from historically marginalized identities, there needs to be a particular consciousness that we carry. And so we know that if Black, Latinx, Indigenous, queer, trans, disabled, rural youth are most at harm when we look at the numbers and data on our end, we know that these are the folks that we need to bring in, and we need to bring them in with a lot of care. So I want to go ahead and kind of just change the energy. We're going to do some imagination work. I want some of y'all to go ahead and be able to use some of your creative juices for a little bit. And so I'm going to ask y'all to close your eyes and imagine. Perhaps you can doodle if there's something nearby, or if you're on, you got a phone nearby, you can like use your notepad. But I really want y'all to start visualizing and thinking about different resources that youth might need to come in and do work. And when we ask young people from historically marginalized communities what things they might need to thrive in our spaces, some resources and things to thrive. And as y'all are thinking about that, I will go ahead and just list some of the things that you might be considering. Pay, transportation, if we know that they're from rural communities, or perhaps they're from historically marginalized communities that won't have wealth for transportation, or perhaps parents in the household are working or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and cover some of the ones that we think of, some resources that we believe that youth might need, and some things that we believe that young people might need to thrive. I want y'all to hold me accountable at the end. And if you thought of other things or doodled other things or note tabbed other things, I would love for y'all to share them in the comments. We think that resources should look like, when we bring in young folks from historically marginalized places, our attention. When we bring young folks in, if they vocalize that they need something or that they need something to thrive, that should be something that's taken seriously. To vocalize that is already something, and we need to make sure we're creating an environment where they do feel valued and recognized enough that they can vocalize the things that they need. We think that young people deserve pay, as we've talked about, and it needs to be good pay. A lot of times young people are given the absolute minimum wage because they're not seen to be fully competent or like fully able to contribute. And that's something that we don't think that people can fully contribute if they're not ever put in a space where they're seen to do that. Transportation is another one. So we can figure out carpool systems, lifts, making our things accessible to like a bus location or something like that, or making that accessible to young people and making sure that we can cover that as much as we can. Another thing is giving resources such as like toolkits and different things like that, because when we onboard staff, we typically think of these things, but a lot of times when we onboard youth, we don't give them the full background and scope of work that we're doing around the coalition or organization. We usually just give them the seed that they need to know. Another thing that we can offer young people as a resource or a way for them to thrive is giving them events timed around school. If you would like to do the most and be most accountable, this includes planning things like your staff meetings around you, because if young people are going to be a part of your work, they should be a part of your work, and that should look like something throughout. And when we were talking to our youth organizers about this presentation and about the things that youth wanted to vocalize to other people who were doing work around young folks, they said young folks have more than just school. So when we're planning events around school, also consider their after school activities, the sports. We don't want young people to be making sacrifices between like the communities and the activities they love and the ways that they can show up meaningfully with us. So when we do timing for events, we want to make sure that young folks are also spread really thin, and we want to make sure to alleviate that with time as much as we can. Language accessibility. We try to make all of our print materials, all of our flyers, everything that's getting sent out in multiple languages so that we can have folks from historically marginalized communities come to our events, but also to make sure that it's accessible to youth. If something is just super wordy, it's not necessarily going to compel anyone to come, especially young people. A couple more things that the youth said that they insisted upon was food. We don't want light food. We don't want breath mints that we might have at like the front desk or office in our coalition or organizations. We want them to have food with substance, and if we can, warm, nourishing food, because this is something that young folks have been exerting themselves in school all day, and they're coming to do more labor for us and with us. Childcare is another big one that a lot of us oftentimes overlook. We don't understand that young people can still have children, and oftentimes we don't understand that young people can be caretakers of their siblings and other folks in their community. Something else is representation. If we're going to offer resources to youth and a chance for them to thrive, a resource that we can give them is representation. So when we're having events for young people, there should be people who look like them, and it should be for them, built by them. I'm seeing some things in the comments about other things that y'all are seeing that we can do to give folks an opportunity to thrive when we come into this space, especially knowing that they're already facing disproportionate harm. But as we move forward, I really just want to sum up and re-ingrain that element one is all about building spaces that are deep in community and intentionally supportive for youth leaders across generations and identities, especially youth leaders and youth leaders who come from frontline, heavily impacted, marginalized communities. So all of the work that we should do is built around element one. Dalton, would you start describing element two to all of us?
Sure. Thanks, Nisha. So element two is our transformative youth leadership. And the picture that we have here is from our youth activist network. For most of our meetings, we start in circle and end in circle. And we do circle for many different things, and I can cover that a little bit in this next series. A few things before we get started is Nisha's going to drop the question of what kind of leadership do we expect from youth, and who and which youth are we thinking of when we think about youth leaders? And as you're doing that, the other thing that's really important to mobilizing youth from historically marginalized communities is that you have to have staff that looks like them. And so I know it's the hardest thing to hire new people, but also on the longer terms of your organization, what does that look like in terms of like most of the young people that we knew that were of color and from queer and trans communities, we already knew that were existing within our communities. And if we hadn't had those relationships prior to them, it would have been much harder to recruit them from just cold calling, if that makes sense. So young people have a general distrust of adults. And so it helps if those adults look like them and come from those communities. From our Meaningful Access Guide, we are talking specifically about cultivating leaders who are able to understand and practice co-creation, interrupt habits of adultism, and we need young leaders who are able to meaningfully access each other and the work and the revolution in ways that we've certainly failed. I do know one of the conversations that we've had in the past in our experiential work at the Youth Activist Network is that the habit of overextension, which is a habit of white supremacy, like to produce the most, to always be busy, and young people are in their development into adulthood are becoming keenly aware about why are we preaching about an anti-violence movement when we are engaging in practices that are harmful to our own bodies. And so these are like the heavier conversations that we have with young people, and also really need to have conversations with ourselves. So one of the practices that we do is practicing wholeness. What does wholeness look like in a world where you're forced to be stretched out, where business is glorified, and parts of your identity, especially if you're from the queer and trans community, folks from the disability community, where you're not allowed to ask for help. Otherwise, it's going to be seen. It's going to be seen as a weakness to ask for help. And so the other thing too that we practice is practicing multiculturalism, multiracial, and radically inclusive environments. Young people can really tell when you're turning the side eye, because they're also really good at giving the side eye. And if you're not aware of, or if you're not building a meaningful relationship with folks from different communities, young people will be talking either just like giving each other side eyes, like, did you hear that? That's pretty fucked up. Or they're having those conversations outside. And so you're starting to push out young people before you've even had to have a chance at building deeper relationships with them. The other one is intergenerational approaches, which Nisha was talking about. And this one, we really want to move away from a pyramid of like there's one older person that's at the top and there's young people at the bottom to equate to one voice at the top. And so the other conversation that we've been having is what does a flattened model of leadership looks like. In the Youth Activist Network, when we were talking to young people, it was more like we can share what knowledge and experience we've had in organizing. We can help you find ways to engage your leaders in the communities, but we really can't tell you what to do. And so finding and building their agencies when they're building or thinking about their communities and wanting to change their communities is really, really important. Habits of adultism is always present. I know I'm doing it constantly, and I'm not that far away from them. When I'm saying I'm sorry, I have other pressing work, and the time that I've allotted for you is going to get cut short. And that, like, if I were to tell any of my older colleagues that same thing, they're going to walk away feeling some type of way unless they understand that, like, I can make it up to them. And that's not really ideal, but sometimes it needs to happen. But in those moments, it's a very critical moment to make sure that you're still listening to them, following up with them, and not just pushing them to the side. Spaciousness. So one of the things that we do is when we're spending a lot of time with young people and to interrupt the habits of white supremacy of overextension, we are building time and space for young people to just be. Because there's a difference between just hanging out together and being able to do that and being forced to do things that just hanging out together can replicate in relationship building. That it includes connection, breathing, nourishment, circle, and so that's also art supplies, collective readings. So there's a We Choose All of Us collective reading that Nisha, can you drop that in the chat, please?
I actually don't have that one, the We Choose All of Us poem.
Oh, okay, cool. We'll find a way to get it to you. And then the other thing too is practicing experiential learning. It's pretty hard to learn with a PowerPoint style when you've been in school all day, when that's all you've seen at school. And so we try to do a lot of experiential learning. And an activity that we did with the young people is the city building activity, which is pretty messed up. And then we had broken up into the groups. That's the poem. Thank you, Stuart. Wow, that was fast. um, and so, and the city building activities, we broke them up into about 5 or 6 groups, and they were tasked to build the biggest and most beautiful city with different art supplies. And it was really messed up because some groups had all the supplies with tape, paper, markers, and then actually having a better environment to build their city in. And other groups just had markers. Another group just had paper. And so these are a small analogy of what's happening within our communities, but we are able to explore and these deeper concepts in our that's happening in our world, but in a less traumatic but more playful activity way. And so the task was just only to build the biggest city possible. And in our habits of white supremacy and overextension and competition, they all tried to build cities with the supplies they had. They were not told that they couldn't build a big city together. And so in the same way that we are told to do our little work and produce all of these things, in our community, a lot of people are in the gender-based violence movement, but the grant systems place us in positions where we're always at competition with each other when we don't really necessarily need to. And so we could have just told the young people at the very beginning, was like, don't compete against with each other, find ways to collaborate, and what ways are you using, how are you communicating with each other when you're in moments of like competition. Some young people refused the activity and they all just self-elected out of the activity because they were frustrated, which is also true. Like when we're working with young people and we don't hear them out on their frustration, they're gonna walk out the door. When things to avoid with youth organizing, is avoid making it our job to tell young people what to do or making all these decisions ourselves. And so sometimes we get into this habit of, and we actually just did it like last week, of giving or trying to source all of our like asking them to plan out something when we didn't give them any parameters. And so that's going to leave young people very disappointed when we're going to have to come up with something and some reason to say, this does not work because of X, Y, this, and this grant can't fund that work. But rather, if I had been a better facilitator at that moment, I would have given them the grant narrative to build an activity build out their work plan before I had let them loose on generating ideas. The other thing too is avoid assuming we know better about their experiences than they do. A lot of us are nerds, and so we know and read research, but those research are also very contextualized, not to like disregard all the information that's made by research, because those are very important. But young people know what's happening in their communities. And unless that research specifically studied your community and the geographic location you're in, that might like look very differently too. Avoid creating materials that are supposed to work for young people, but are not written or designed by young people or accessible to youth with disabilities. So make sure that just the very fact that when we're writing language, language is the tool of our oppressors. And so what does it mean to have language that is both revolutionary, but also doesn't leave people in the margins? Very specific fonts work better for people who are visually impaired. And so finding different ways to also work with folks with different varying levels of disability, and also engaging them in ways to move forward towards that world without gender-based violence. Avoid inviting to youth to be a part of something after it has already been organized rather than collaborating from the beginning. Again, we're still working on these and we'll never claim to be perfect, but if inviting young people is an afterthought, that place won't likely be friendly for young people, and they'll either end up really confused or just want to not engage during that meeting. Avoid approaches that focus on deficits rather than strengths. All too quickly, we can overfocus on an outside perspective on what has happened to someone rather than their strength. Don't refer to youth as at risk or in need of saving. So when we're working with historically marginalized communities, this is super, super important that we're not perpetuating the narratives of white saviorship. Young people know when we're being paternalistic towards them. And so it's really important to have really meaningful conversations about what they need instead of believing what they need, and having their agency be at the center and forefront of their activism and our engagement with them. It's similar to how we're working with survivors. We never want to take away their agency in their healing process, because that is critical to their healing. In the same way that we should work with survivors, we're working with young people who are survivors of other kinds of violence within their communities. So in the chat boxes, if you want to engage, name one transformative experience that you had, and I can give a narrative, and I can give a story while you're trying to type those in. So when I was younger, I was very much the model minority, an immigrant to this country, a single child from a middle-class family. And so I was good at all of these things. But when we started multiracial and cross-cultural work at the coalition, I was not the first person of color in our youth organizing program. And so one thing that one specific experience was working with Rachel and Monica Dennis, who are also a part of, are intricately related to MEV and Novo, was that I always have the answer when I'm working with them, and so I was always eager to please. And one conversation that I had with Monica Dennis was just about, why do I need to have all of the answers, and at the same time, all of the answers, and why do I have to do the answers? I wonder, why do I have to present all of the answers right now? And so I was like, it's just out of fear of my own safety. And so that question was about me and my racial identity, and hoping to make myself useful to white people so that I am not discarded. And so that was communicated to the other young folks that I was just a know-it-all and I wanted to prove myself better than them. But in the reality, asking young people where they're at and meeting where they're at to move forwards is a better engagement strategy, rather than they could have just easily let me go and kicked me out of the workshop. Ooh. And then, if anyone doesn't have any reflections on transformative experiences,
we'll give some folks some time as they're starting to think of just like different transformative ways. One of the other things that we were able to do with the Youth Activist Network, which was another idea that Dalton had beyond the like city building activity. Maybe this one might be similar. Y'all can model it off of. So I put in the chat, we had this like flip the tarp activity where we put a bunch of sheets on the ground, and we told folks that like they were going to be standing on the tarps. They were going to be really proximal to each other. So if they didn't feel comfortable, they didn't need to, they could just observe and have like some sort of examination that they could offer all of us. And the other people who wanted to participate in a different sense physically would all be on the tarp. And I believe we had 3 of them, and we had the young folks spread throughout them. And we essentially said, now that you're all standing on it, we need you to find a way to flip it over. And that was basically the only parameter that we put on it. We told them that they had a given amount of time. We put like a song on, and they knew by the end of the music that they had to be on the other side of the tarp. And they easily could have all jumped on one tarp, flipped the others, hopped onto those two, flipped the main tarp kind of thing. Like they easily could have found a way to collaborate. And instead it was very competitive and they were operating out of scarcity and there were so many things. And so we were able to really define leadership and just really transform the ways we showed up together differently. So I encourage y'all to share some in the chat, like Dalton was encouraging, just because this is a cool way to get ideas from y'all. Like I see under the same roof, that was another good activity. So I welcome y'all to go ahead and just share some activities and ideas with yourselves. And as y'all are doing that, I just want to go ahead and recap some of the things I got from this slide. Like when we think of youth leaders, and when we think of what we typically expect from youth leaders, we think of wonderful things like I had already seen in the chat about things like inclusive, open leadership. And a lot of times we unfortunately build this like exceptional youth, exceptional activist narrative where young people are going to be able to show up and they've got all the things, they see all the things, you know, the youth are the future, the youth are so progressive and they get it. And while those things are true, we also want to give grace and understand that young folks will mess up. Young folks won't always be able to show up in the best ways and ways that we can mitigate that and ways that we can mitigate the harm that we provide to young people who are giving them their whole selves. We can do things like a little list that we sent out of practicing wholeness, practicing multiculturalism, making sure that we have spaciousness, whether we do art, we sit in a circle, we interrupt business overextension, yada, yada, yada. So those things are all so important in the ways that we transform youth leadership. And I would love to see some ideas that y'all might have on some of those experiences, but let's go ahead and kick it to the next slide. When we think about youth leadership in element 2, something that is so imperative to our work is understanding that we cultivate inner wisdom, we generate power and skills. So by this, I mean that we already know that youth have wisdom and power and skills, and we know that they're already equipped with everything that they need to thrive, and they're already guided on a path that serves them toward liberation. We cannot see youth as empty vessels, especially because they're viewed this way throughout a lot of their school system and their school days, where there's these empty vessels where we have to like pour knowledge into them. And then once they're full, they're whole, capable, brilliant people who can finally do productive work. And we know that that's not true and we need to debunk that. So we instead view the ways that we work with youth as a way to harness and cultivate their youth leadership, not really like force feeding it or expecting it without any sort of nourishment. I'm seeing things that there's just like general themes about redefining the ways that we see and engage with youth leaders and youth leadership. And as we focus on element 1, which is all about building spaces that are deep in community and intentionally supportive for youth leaders across generations and communities, I think it's also really important to understand that element 2 is all about framing leadership in a way that's emergent. And cultivating youth leadership is something that looks to youth as being whole, capable, brilliant people. And knowing that to get to those two things, it's going to look like a lot of experiential, consistently generative things that look at the ways that we lead in different ways. I will go ahead and start to monitor the chat box and hop onto that. Element 3 is my favorite. I've been looking forward to element 3 all day. So Dalton, I would love if you could go ahead and start to ground us in element 3, and then I'll come back to the chat box to respond more to Hatchley.
Thanks, Nisha. So element 3, so we're gonna do, so what you see in the picture, let's start there, is us doing breathing practices with the young people in our youth activist network. And young people are really worried about their bodies. Their bodies are changing so fast. And so we have to be mindful of that. And so they're not the most, I mean, I am not the most comfortable person with my body, but also young people are keenly not known to be most comfortable with their bodies. And so we're going to invite everyone to one of the a few of the practices that we shared with the young people to interrupt habits of overextension and just to ground ourselves. So we're going to do mountains, clouds, and then mountains. So mountains is when we take a deep inhale in and raise our arms towards the right, and then exhale as we put our arms down. And then we lean to the other side, inhale in, exhale out. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. 2 more. Try to keep your eyes on the horizon. Inhale, exhale. And then the next one that we're going to do, and Nisha's modeling this standing up, by the way. Next one we're going to do is clouds. So we're going to hold a very little cloud, or as big as a cloud as you want. And then we're going to use our breath on the exhale to move that across our body. So inhale, and then exhale. Inhale, move it across your body the other way. Inhale, exhale, and then we're going to do 2 more. Inhale, exhale. 1 more. And then we're going to go back to mountains. So inhale, exhale, relax your shoulders. Inhale, feel your feet on the ground. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. And then 1 more. And then a big sigh on your way out. Thank you for trying that on. We'd love to hear from you in the chat box and what that felt like. And then I'm going to do a few more things, or a few more element, or a few more or little things on their element 3. Whoa, struggle. So practices to replace, instead of habits of dominant culture, are physical practice. So breathing is one of them. Tai Chi, meditation, and other physical practices to connect to our mind and body and spirit, to incorporate into your spaces when you're working with young people. So we had the very opportune moment of working with Norma Wang, and her teacher, Stephen Cow, led us through the 10-step Tai Chi. And so young people are a little bit weird about their bodies again with Tai Chi, but we can break those down, like do 1 or 2 steps and for them to learn. The other thing too about when we're doing breathing is it helps us decolonize our bodies when we're working with them. We know that when we're breathing, men are supposed to be breathing from up here, so it makes their chest bigger, but then that just depletes them of their oxygen. And then when their women are breathing, they're made to they're asked to be small with their bodies. And like what we do in our work starts with our breath. And so that is one of the ways we can connect our mind, body, and spirit. And then the other thing too is spaciousness. We're all very bad at this. If you work for a nonprofit, I'm just going to say we're bad at this. So like habits of just eating at your desk instead of taking the full 15 minutes that you're, or 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes just to move away from your desk listen to what your body's needs are while you're eating your food. And some people, won't name any names in the office, myself, sometimes just forgo eating a meal. And so by the time at the end of the day, I'm super hangry, cranky, and I'm not the most wholesome version of me. And that was because choices I made in not caring for my body throughout the day. The other thing too, I said earlier was the meditation. Meditation can look very different in very different people's bodies, particularly if you're a person who experiences trauma. Meditation can look like while you're in movement. And so when we're doing meditation, we ask them not to close their eyes if they're not comfortable, because that is triggering to some folks. So you're always encouraged to adapt these to however you need them in your group setting. The other thing too is that we tell a story about musicians when we're breathing together. So when we breathe together, eventually our hearts start beating at the same rate. Musicians who are woodwind instruments, when they're playing instruments and taking breaths at the same time, not only is their music better, but also their hearts and minds sync up to produce something very beautiful. We always tell our young people this story when they're hesitant to move with us because they feel awkward with their bodies, because there's simply something greater at risk. It's a world where everyone's working together, where everyone's in community, where everyone is in harmonious movement together. And that is one of the ways we can move through all of this violence together and live into a world where everyone is cared for and valued. Storytelling is one of my favorite ways, and that's why you hear a lot of stories from us when we're working, when we're trying to tell other people or share our experiences with youth organizing, is because stories is how we learn best as human beings. Like campfire stories of our ancestors who are fleeing violence, that is still in our cellular memory. I don't know what happened when we started reading books to believe that we were going to be more enlightened that way, because that does provide us a way and access into the world. But stories is something that is really important, and it's in borrowed tradition from indigenous peoples around the world. So the last one is nourishment. Healthy, nourishing food. Sometimes we spoil the young people and we get greasy pizza. But greasy pizza is cheap and delicious, but often not. It is not the best, healthiest option for them. And we always try to buy extra food so that young people are able to take it home if they need to. But food is super essential, because when you're working with young people after school, it's been about 3 to 5 hours since they've last eaten their meal. If your school provides food. We're grateful that Idaho still provides food, reduced and free lunch here, but it's not the same place. It's not the same narrative for everyone. And then I'm going to pass it off to Nisha to talk about element 4, our transformative campaigns.
Yes, thank you so much. So element 4 focuses on campaigns, which is very, very broad. One of the things that we had done with our youth activist network, the group of like 35 to 40 young folks that we had been working with for just different like social justice based approaches in our communities to interrupt harm, we said that at the end of this, we have the capacity and resources to do up to 3 campaigns. And campaigns can literally mean just whatever initiative you'd like to move forward with, obviously some consideration and some thought behind it. And we had been doing meaningful work about having conversations about what liberation looked and smelled and felt and tasted like, and all of those things, and also ways that we unknowingly uphold harm. And so we had equipped ourselves with a lot of the context and the foundation that we wanted to build campaigns also off of. And then we went ahead and just let the reins free, understanding that, again, young people already had everything that they needed to thrive. This was just something we needed to collaborate on together. And the ideas that they came up were amazing. I want to briefly go through the 3 campaigns that they did in case that y'all find seeds of things that y'all could replicate or mirror within your own systems. But then we'll go ahead and talk about some other campaigns and share some resources so y'all can actually see the things that we're talking about and replicate that more meaningfully. Okay, so the Youth Activist Network, they came up with 3 different campaigns. And the first of which was they wanted to come up with a way to name the fact that people in Idaho were not getting comprehensive sex education, especially sex education that is inclusive of different like genders, sexual orientations, etc. And so they decided that they were going to come up with a video that was going to be inclusive of these different identities so that young people could experience pleasure in a way that was not going to replicate and uphold harm. And so they created a video, and they decided that they not only wanted to share amongst themselves and with different groups who seemed like they were open to it, they also wanted to share it with educators in Idaho. So they started trying to find ways to network to different school counselors and teachers and different things like that. Also knowing that there are different systems and different things like that as we power map, so that they also were able to create a way to share this video with youth so that this information was still out there while it was still waiting to be ingrained into different classrooms throughout the state who might be receptive to it. So that was really neat. This was something that they were passionate about. This is something that they were able to see leadership in all sorts of ways, because all of a sudden the person who was really good at tech stuff is a huge leader, and they never saw themselves as a leader before. So this was a really exciting campaign that the youth took on. Another transformative campaign that the young folks came up with in the Youth Activist Network was a awareness campaign for climate change. There had been conversations about ways we can show up for climate strikes, ways we can show up to reduce harm on the planet and thus reduce harm in our communities, interrupting violence on our earth, and then in turn interrupting violence within our communities. They decided that they could create a network between middle schools and high schools that would start really emphasizing the need of recycling initiatives, while also they decided, well, if we want this, a lot of people want this too, but they might not have resources for it. So our campaign could be something such as creating posters that are green that we can give to middle schools and high schools so that they have the imagery and they have the vocalization that they've been craving but not necessarily having. So young folks started delivering and shipping out different ways that we could make that happen across the entire state. And the third campaign that I'll talk to you about that the Youth Activist Network did, they decided that they'd been looking at the different schools throughout our community, and there had been a few schools, and one in particular that caught their attention, that had had a mascot which used Indigenous caricatures. And so in Boise High School, it is the Boise Brave mascot, and it is an Indigenous caricature. It's terrible. And the young people decided that there had been efforts and initiatives that were looking to alleviate it and start to make change, but the young people were saying, on whose time, to what extent, why is this like a 50-year plan? Why can't this be immediate? And so they created a way, basically a comprehensive plan for things that we could start returning these specific things back to Indigenous communities. We can start stopping these school traditions. We can start reframing our curriculum in these ways and our school traditions around these things. And it was really, really powerful. And just to be transparent with y'all, because I feel like you're going to be doing similar work and similar just experiential moments of learning, that campaign ended up getting very ugly because there was a lot of parts of dominant culture that hopped out. We were quite literally talking about the erasure of communities and upholding white supremacy as we're trying to change this mascot. And there was a lot of habits of dominant culture and white supremacy that came from that. And although we think that we equipped our youth, and although the youth said that they felt very equipped, it was really scary just to know that, like, the work we were doing, we could never fully create an element of safety for our young people in like a verbal sense or anything, just being exposed to things that don't feel good and that cause harm. And so I challenge y'all to hold the fact that the work that you do will be experiential. You can set yourselves up for success, and you will experience failure and shortcoming and harm. And overall, those 3 campaigns were some of the most successful things that I've seen and the biggest force of change I've seen firsthand in our community in a long time. So campaigns can look anything like that. Transformative campaigns can look like anything. But we also do know that we have more successful events throughout the year that we look forward to that are more proactive. They're healing campaigns, such as the one in the background for this image. It's Chalk Heart, which is an event I'll talk about in a little bit. And an event like Stories for Our Collective Future, which is a poetry event that we usually have in person, but we just recently had it on Zoom because of COVID. And I know that some of y'all had been talking about what this looks like moving online. And so as we're talking about these transformative campaigns, we'll start to talk about the ways that we've started doing these online also. So Dalton, if you would go ahead and start talking about some of these campaigns like Stories for Our Collective Future, I will go ahead and drop a link here for people to go ahead and access some of our toolkits.
Thanks, Tisha. So cultural transformations. So we try to engage young people at all levels. So our Youth Activist Network is like a deep dive into changing narratives for them around their communities. And those are big, we invest a lot of time in that in terms of like creating and developing those materials. But we also want to engage people in more rural communities. And that's why I'm so really grateful to work with y'all here, because there's rural communities here. It might be possible to have those group settings, learnings with the young folks in person, but the large majority of our work is also placed in cultural transformation campaigns. And so like what Sarah said, we distribute a lot of posters to all of our rural programs here, and also all of the schools, secondary schools in Idaho. It's a lot. It's like a whole 2 weeks of just mailings from our office, and we do all of that in-house. But so the purpose of sending of all of these posters out to local community members is to begin small conversations that begin to shape the narrative for a different possibility for the future. And you can access this on our website. And because of our COVID closures, it might take a while before they get sent out to you. But if you're an OVW grantee, we can send it out to you for free, and we'll find ways for people who aren't able to pay for shipping, because that's the only thing that we charge for, to find ways to get it to you for free. But this year, we had Christy C. Rhodes, which is a really famous artist, Cuban-American artist, to work with us on our themes. And so I'm just going to read off some of the themes with us for you so that you can kind of know what it's about. So the first one is love. What is possible when we love ourselves and others authentically? Wholeness. What is possible when we are free to be our whole selves? Joy. What is possible when we find real joy in ourselves? Consciousness. What is possible when we dream? Yeah, that's one of my favorite pictures ever. It's just a person who's fed in the dark, and there's a full moon behind them, and it's really beautiful. And we're not directly talking about gender-based violence here, but because of our name and what's attached to our name, it's implicitly about gender-based violence too. So these are smaller conversations we're having, that we hope people are having, in hopes that when the revolution does come and we need to start changing people's minds in a more urgent scale, it's a lot easier to do. And then,
More campaigns. So Dalton, I really love the point that you had made about like some of our campaigns are supposed to be extensive. They're supposed to be really experiential. We do a lot of deep dives. We spend a lot of time. other campaigns, we know that people aren't able to come. Maybe they're there for like an hour. This is like a once every couple months or something that they have the opportunity, or something along the lines of that. So we also want to sprinkle in some ideas for y'all on that, such as our story share challenge. We connect people and young folks together to our entire community, basically through stories and narrative, because we think that the shortest distance between two people is a story, and stories have a lot of power. So we come together, we hold stories, we share them with each other, and we practice deep vulnerability and deep listening, and what that looks like and how we move forward while we hold someone else's story. And it's really powerful. We had done this online. We basically will be on Zoom. We'll go on small breakout rooms. We'll do things like that. And the marketing for it is an important thing. We have the poetry event that we usually do, which is in person, where it now is like a Zoom thing, and we will have a lineup and try to make it clear and play music. And obviously there's so many challenges between making a space that used to have food and music and vibrance and community now in a Zoom space where people also get on Zoom for work and for school and for things like that. So really just finding ways to bring life into it and bringing in the important themes that we'd be able to talk about in person in a way that seems accessible and concise when people are on a Zoom chat. Every spring, we usually do another campaign called Chalk Heart, which is wonderful. It's basically middle school and high school students coming together and illustrating writing that has been done by their peers. So when people do like the poetry event, they will share their poems, we will publish their poems and talk about these bigger conversations about what liberation is in our community now. And then in Chalk Art, we'll come back and use those poems as inspiration for art. And we'll have these groups come together for 90 minutes and create art and generate art at that event for stuff that we'll use throughout the entire year for other campaigns and other things that we can use. So we'll use that imagery and really let folks know then and there that like leadership looks like anything, and involvement looks like anything. And this campaign is a form of liberation also. And this is something that we can continue to take forward. And youth really seem to love that event. We were talking this year about like what that might look like online. And I really challenge y'all to be creative in the ways that you can find social media campaigns, whether it's like an Instagram challenge or something like that, and incorporating art into our campaigns, because that also connects back to element 3, which is a lot of just healing, restorative, using art and healing as a way of resilience. So element 4 covers the ways that we campaign and engage with youth events and community. And I would love for y'all to be able to ask more questions about what those events look like in specificity. If y'all would like to detail some of those events within your own community. But I also want to make space for element 5. Element 5 is movements rooted in our interdependence across communities and issues. And Dalton and I are going to go back quite a bit on this slide, because this one is just talking about our overall narrative about the movements that are coming out and the ways that we really find solidarity and power through all of that. So I don't know what y'all know of Idaho, or when you think of Idaho, what you think about, but I would popularly say are known to be conservative, white, and really intolerant. And while that's true to an extent, we also know that there's people like Dalton and I are not necessarily, we're exceptional, but we're not necessarily rare. And that there are hungry activists and emerging activists across generations and communities and social justice issues who are ready to work together for another world and a new way of existing together. So Dalton, can you describe some of the movements that we've been seeing and the ways that we're really stressing this importance on movements being interdependent on each other?
Yeah, and so this is our Families Together, Belong Together rally, and a bunch of young folks came and turned out. So young folks from the immigrant justice community was there. Our young folks from the gender-based violence movement was there. And we really started having conversations together about what gender-based violence looks like on the border, and how violence is so intricately connected to other forms of violence. And so we know that people who are undocumented find it difficult to go ask for help and report it to the police for fear of deportations. We know that man camps near oil fields have been related and to the violence perpetrated towards Indigenous women, and the connection between land and Indigenous women is super strong. And so those are other ways too. And we know that also violence happens in prisons. And so what are our personal stances on incarceration, and how do we make sure that if people are incarcerated, that they remain safe and whole and are not exposed to gender-based violence in there too. No one in our society is dispensable, and so all people deserve to live in a safe space. And so in Idaho, we had the Women's March, the DACA rally, the anniversary of the Women's March, and June. We came 2 years ago to protest what was happening in our communities. We're leading what we do know is that if it can happen in places like Idaho, we hope that it can happen in places that's more progressive and more ready, willing, and open for change. Nisha, do you want to do really quickly about the letter, and then we'll leave it up for Q&A?
Yeah, we want to make sure to have time to hear from y'all. One of the last things that we wanted to talk to y'all about of just different ways that we've been able to experience movements rooted across interdependence in our communities. We were able to create a letter to Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who had a few years back come out with a narrative saying basically there is going to be a Supreme Court nomination with Brett Kavanaugh. It's a lifetime appointment. However, he has been, he's allegedly up for sexual violence. And so Dr. Christine Blasey Ford came up with her testimony and came up with her narrative, and there was a large motion of support. And so I just shared a link for the support we were able to see. What had happened behind the scenes, we had at the time 3 15-year-old people who were young femmes, and they saw themselves in the things that Dr. Ford was saying about being a 15-year-old girl, experiencing harm, understanding that like harm is just this ongoing thing, which does not need to be an ongoing thing. And it was really powerful because we get this narrative of being just a red state, and we ended up defying all of that and showing people that regardless of their background, they had some 15-year-old in them that resonated with this. And I really encourage y'all to read this if you have time. I would love to read it to y'all today, but just in terms of timeliness, I'm not going to. It was really powerful. We created it intergenerationally. We had the young folks creating ideas. We had other folks and experienced writers on our team coming together and drawing main themes. And we published this piece, which ended up getting over 117,000 signatures. It was published in The Hill, The Washington Post, Teen Vogue. There were so many things that came from this, and I think the most powerful was really just that level of interdependence and that narrative that comes out of even in red communities, even in red states, in places like Idaho and rural places, we see people coming out and being powerful and being able to really just reach and bridge communities and identities together. So just a brief recap about all of these elements. Element 1 is all about equipping youth with supportive, deep communities across age and background and holding ourselves accountable to that. Element 2 is renewing our definitions of leadership and who we expect to be leaders. Number 3 is about trade and restorative practices that maintain youth and their ability to show up for change. Element 4 is about fueling campaigns and events which energize young people and their peers to show up for issues in interdependent communities. And element 5 is about rooting and rerouting ourselves in movements which connect us all, because we understand that when young people can connect with other change makers and other communities and stakeholders, we have the ability to create mass scale movements and we can do mass scale change. So these 5 elements are really powerful. Dalton and I have been working with this as we were youth leaders ourselves. Now we're a little bit older, we're growing out, and we're looking at ways to pass the torch and share information out with everybody else so that people can try these elements on and change things and adapt alongside youth and ask questions either with us or with youth so that we can continue to find ways to spark liberation. If there's anything else Dalton wants to mention, I will go ahead and make space for them. But at this point, I would love to hear any and all ideas, questions, thoughts, and theories y'all might have for us. Dalton, we already have a question here from Edwin. Would you like to address that?
For sure. I'm going to just stop screen sharing because I think people are comfortable with just using, just because it's a lot easier this way.
Yes, let's look at each other's faces. Let's do Brady.
All right. So the question is, do you have any perspectives on very large populations? I'm in LA, and we are one of the most progressive regions, and sheer size and scale can become overwhelming and feel scattered. So this is what we're talking about when we're cross-movement building work. Other people are already mobilizing community in your communities. What does it look like to form partnerships with those communities and relating it to gender-based violence? They are most likely willing to share space and share resources because young people, it takes a lot of energy to manage a bunch of young people. And so if that answers your question, I think holding that community space with not just by yourself or your sole organization or even just by your sole self and holding that space with other people is really, really important.
I also want to say on that there's been, it's the best thing as like an organizer when something goes wildly right and you have way more people than you imagine. And so I'm imagining just like creating an event or some sort of opportunity and maybe having just a really large scale groups that comes really overwhelming. And one of the things that when I came into this work, I am like Capricorn, organized, type A, blah, 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 blah. And I was not okay with the flexibility and the malleability. And some youth come in 30 minutes late and they don't really have an excuse, but there was transportation or whatever. It's justified. But to me, it's very like, boom, 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 where's the system? And I have realized that especially element 3, all of the things of like grounding in purpose, having intentions, doing breathing, having spaciousness, all of those things really help to harness spaces where we could just name in the space like, hey, this is really big and we didn't expect it. Let's take a 5-minute bio break where we can do some breath and reconvene. And things like that do help. So I'm not sure how to exactly answer that perfectly, Edwin, but I really divert you to element 3 as just personal experience and trying to figure out how to adjust with that overwhelming feeling.
And then we have a question from Jesse. Who have been key adult allies along the way for your campaigns? And were they already keen to the issues, or did you provide in lots of education and youth or connections? Okay, so this one's a good one. We always get pushback from our executive director, but if we can say it in a language that she can hear, it's great. But sometimes it takes 1 or 2 tries. And so don't always... I don't like saying this, but because it sounds really rapey, but like, don't always take the first no when you're trying to organize with young people and ask for permission, because most likely they're not in a headspace to talk about what's expansive for your community. Keep persistent about what it means to engage young people. And one of the best things I've ever heard is like prevention is the best investment in our community that we could do rather than prevention and response are both important, but like if we can get to them before we get to them on the response side, a lot of harm we have already been prevented within our communities. The other thing I would say is that we hired 2 organizers within our community, which is very different from most coalitions across the United States. So the hiring of, they were well-versed in political work and also mobilizing the migrant farmer workers movement here. And so we have that political and organizing strategy side already made, and which made it much more feasible for our executive directors to say, oh, this is actually a viable way of organizing young people. Nisha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I want to say that like one of our intentions is like sometimes stakeholders, power holders in our events or in our communities for issues are not always keen and receptive to the work that we do. And so we're, especially when we bring ourselves, but especially young folks into this space, we want to make sure that they're not in a space where it's going to be harmful. So if we have any sort of radar detection that it might not be good, it's not that we're just going to say like, young people, you can't be here, you can't handle it. We will just have very intentional conversations about how we can prepare ourselves, how we can equip ourselves, how we might respond if things go a certain way, while also entering that space with all of the practices that we possibly can to make sure that that's something. And for the most that I can think about, like a lot of the things that we think of, people are keen to our issues because we're together and in these spaces for a reason. There just will always be habits of ageism until we can completely dismantle that, which is what we're all here actively working to do. So I would just name that. Okay. Another comment in the chat says, when trying to engage youth in schools on certain topics, we sometimes push back from our contacts at schools who do not want us to talk about those topics, LGBTQ+, oppression, etc. How would you approach that situation? Because those topics are so important to teach, talk about, but older adults are serving as roadblocks. Yes, I love that. I will go ahead, yes, seek at least one champion. There are people in every school, whether it's like the secretary, maybe like a sociology teacher, the teacher who owns the GSA, and something like that, the Gay Student Alliance. There is a seed in every community, and I'm so convinced of that we can start to entry point. And sometimes we don't know who that is, and so that's hard. And I think that there's a lot of power that I've just seen within my own lived experience and community about like an element of code switching. And there, young people, I don't think that it serves any purpose to show up to a space and talk about stuff without talking about stuff to young people. If you're like, don't do bad things when you're hanging out with people that you might be interested in, that doesn't serve purpose because they need to hear the conversation. And I think there's a way to frame things and word things about how we need to support each other and protect each other, and then having conversations with young people about here's how we mitigate harm and here's the ways that we've been seeing oppression and violence because they know what's up. Dalton, what would you say about that one? I think that that's such a good way of overcoming roadblocks.
So when we only talked about gender-based violence, we were invited to schools and things like that. When we started talking about oppression and then the revolution needs to happen, we start getting invitations to go into schools, which is a pro and con thing. But the other thing too is what Nisha said. You don't have to market that you're going to be talking about the revolution. And if the students bring it up themselves, you are the person in that room most equipped probably to have that conversation. So even if that means that that you won't get invited back, at least you were able to engage with young students and then provide them with other opportunities when you're not being invited back into the door to get engaged with their communities. I also recognize that those are sometimes deliverables, and so you have to be careful about them. But there are more implicit ways to have conversations with young people without talking about the revolution, but still having those heart-to-heart conversations in the world.
Yeah, I feel like if anything, if there's one takeaway, you hopefully get all of the 5 elements. If there's one thing that you take away from this, I hope that it's a way to balance that there are times that we need to figure out ways to keep showing up and doing this work. And one of my favorite quotes that we learned from a social justice conference a couple years back was basically just to do the work that is so important and it looks so fierce because it is interrupting harm in every way that like you might really wonder if you're going to be invited back in spaces because people have not seen anything so wonderful yet. And I hope that that is like a challenge for all of us to move up to, all while understanding that like we can still be showing up and doing wonderful work and creating spores of liberation and excitement. I thank y'all so much for having space, and I see the survey that people are posting. Please click on that. I will give space over, but if y'all have more questions, please ask it and attach your email so Dalton and I can go ahead and answer them later.
Thank you so much. I feel like a silent round of applause. It's like, thank you for being here. If you have questions that you didn't get to ask or that you think of later as you're processing, please do feel free to send them out to us. We can loop Nisha and Dalton in. It's been great to have you all here. Please do fill out the survey, and we will, of course, send out follow-up information, and the recording for this webinar will be on the hub. And that's it. Do you want to add anything, Sarah? We're sorry to not be in Sacramento with all of you.
Oh, yeah, it was supposed to be an in-person, huh?
It's on my calendar. It makes me sad when I look at this week's calendar.
I deleted everything because it was too sad. Anyway, Lisa, I saw that you had one last question.
Oh, good. I'm sorry.
I can connect you with Nisha and Dalton to answer that, and then other folks. Please just, if you think of something after, please shoot me an email. Y'all know how to get in touch with us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you
Have
so
a
much.
great rest of your week.
Thank you so much, Chicalcasa. Y'all come visit Idaho.
Yeah.
Any old time.
Anytime. Thank you.